Well, thanks so much for coming. My name's Nicole Allen. I'm the Director of Open Education for Spark, and I'm going to be talking about the topic of navigating the fine print of the textbook market and what OER advocates need to know. My background, I've been working in open education for 15 years since I was a student, frustrated with the high cost of textbooks and seeking a better way to do things and get people access to knowledge. And over the years, the textbook industry has evolved a lot. And it's sometimes hard to understand the dynamics that are going on and be able to navigate the decisions that are being made on your campuses. During this presentation, what I'm going to do is I'll first start out with some quick background of the history of the textbook market, leading up to talking a little bit about introductory information about inclusive access for those who aren't familiar, and then talking about three types of fine print that you're going to encounter. First, vendor contracts. Second, federal regulations. And third, investor statements, or statements that vendors make to their investors. And since we only have 40 minutes, I'm going to move pretty quickly, but I will share these slides in Oxford Abstracts so you can catch up on anything that you missed. So we've all seen some version of a graph like this about textbook prices rising. And of course, this graph starts in the early 2000s after textbook prices had already risen 4 times the rate of inflation. And what we often don't talk as much about is how we got here. And how we got here is that the textbook market doesn't work like a normal market because students are captives. They have to buy whatever textbooks they've been assigned by faculty, and that gives publishers a disproportionate amount of power to be able to set prices. And what this gave them is what the CEO of Cengage once referred to as the magical price lever. Anytime textbook publishers wanted to increase their revenue, all they had to do was increase prices and students would have to pay more. And they did it year over year over year throughout the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. And what also happened during that time is, or what happened over the last decade or so, the last 15 years or so, was a change. And that textbooks actually started getting easier for students to afford because they had access to more options. The rise of e-commerce and the availability of open educational resources, of course, expanded the ways that students can save money on textbooks. And as a result, textbook spending, at least according to some studies, trended down over the last decade. And we reached the situation where, as more and more students were buying used books and buying rentals and avoiding paying those super high prices that publishers were setting for print books, the magical price lever broke. And that's why we see this fluctuation in the last 5 years of textbook prices. And when the magical price lever broke, the publishing industry essentially maxed out how much they could increase those print prices and had to change. But they had a problem. Their only option was to be able to charge more students for textbooks, since they couldn't charge individual students more. And the only real way to do that is through digital. And the problem they had is that digital textbooks have been available since at least the early 2010s in most major titles, but students were not buying them in bulk, even though those options were available and were discounted. And that's how we got to this model of inclusive access. And understanding this history is really important because we got here as a solution to a problem that the industry faced, not necessarily a problem that institutions or students faced. And when we talk about inclusive access, what we're talking about is a textbook procurement model that's based on an agreement between an institution, a bookstore, and publishers. Digital content is delivered to students by the first day of class, typically through a learning management system. Students have to be able to opt out of the charge under federal regulations, which we'll talk about in a second. And then the cost gets billed to their tuition and fees. And because we're talking about digital materials, typically students lose access to the content. So this model, so I'm speaking from a US context. This model has become very widespread. A lot of campuses have some version of this model. And as open education advocates, many of us may have encountered confusion over this type of model with OER. And I would say in many cases, the confusion is deliberate because the vendors that have been promoting inclusive access have adopted a lot of the messaging that the OER community has been effectively using to advocate for OER over the years. So I wouldn't be a good OER advocate if I didn't show this slide, but just noting that there are some very important differences. So to somebody who's completely new to textbooks, they sound similar, but they're very key differences. That, OER provides access forever. Students can choose a low-cost print option if they want. Students keep the materials forever. The materials openly licensed, whereas with inclusive access, every group of students is basically paying the access fee for access to the same materials over and over and over again. And there are all sorts of, restrictions and limitations. There are two ways that inclusive access is typically implemented. The first is the course-by-course model, which probably, if you're in the US, most of your campuses are going to have some version of this, where it's sort of a course-by-course thing. Students in participating courses are charged the cost of the specific materials that they've been assigned. And then the second model is the flat fee model. And this is sometimes called equitable access. I recommend against the use of that term because it is not an accurate use of the word equitable. But this is where students are essentially charged an average price for access to all of their materials. And it just sort of works out that some students are going to pay more and some students are going to pay less. And you just pay a flat rate per credit hour. And just to show examples, this is an example of a course-by-course inclusive access where there's one course that has it and one course that doesn't. And then this is an example of a flat fee program where you see it's $25 per credit hour for access to all of your required materials. So the key differences are that with the course-by-course program, students have a lot more flexibility. It's not every course. The faculty can decide whether they want to enroll their course in it or not. Students can opt out on a course-by-course basis. And courses that use OER are always free to students, or use all OER are always free to students. Whereas these flat fee or so-called equitable access programs, students are paying an average price. Opt-out is all or nothing. So all of your courses or none of your courses. Often outsourced to a vendor, and we'll be coming back to that in a second, who's in charge of implementing the program on behalf of the institution. All faculty have to do it, so there's some choice taken away there. And then a big concerning feature of this from an OER perspective is that all of the progress that the community and field has made in advancing the adoption of OER and lower cost materials, all of that work is going to subsidize the selection of more expensive materials in other courses. And from a student perspective, if you're conscientious in exercising your agency to select courses that are lower cost, you don't get to see the benefit of that unless you're able to opt out of all of your courses. All right, so that ends the background portion of the show. That sets us up to dive deep into some fine print. And I realized that as a policy wonk, having a 40-minute session talking about fine print is treacherous. So I'm going to do my best to keep this high level, and then we can dive into questions either here or in the comments to follow up later. So the first type of fine print I want to talk about is federal regulations. And there are a number of state and federal laws that pertain to textbook costs. There's a federal law that requires U.S. institutions to disclose the prices of textbooks or at least link to them from the course catalog students use for registration. Many states have those similar laws, and some states, including Texas and West Virginia, have added additional law that addresses inclusive access specifically and ensuring that those prices are disclosed to students. But in terms of what impacts these programs, the understanding what's happening with federal regulations is very important. So in 2016, during the Obama administration, there was a change to an obscure area of federal financial aid regulations that this is the legal citation 34 CFR 668.164 C2 Roman numeral I. And this changed the default for what institutions were able to bill to students' financial aid without their consent. So historically, institutions have always been able to bill the cost of books and supplies to students' federal financial aid account with permission from the student. But they weren't given permission to do that without, or the federal government didn't give them permission to do that without first getting the consent of the student, because the whole idea was for students to have options of where they purchase their course materials. By requiring the institution to get the student's consent, it preserved that agency of students to be able to shop for their materials off campus, on campus, with the place of their choosing. But in 2016, there was a revision to these regulations, and I would argue a change that was made without full consultation or opportunity for public comment, that changed that default so that institutions could charge the cost of books and supplies to students' federal financial aid without first getting their consent, under certain conditions, and they are these conditions. And I'm glossing over some nuance here, but basically this is what we're talking about. First, that the institution has to have an arrangement with a book publisher or other entity to offer the materials to students at below competitive market rates. They have to provide a way for students to obtain the materials by the 7th day of the payment period, which is sort of inherent in these programs and not really relevant. And then 3, that they have to have a policy under which the student can opt out of the way that the institution provides for the students to obtain the books and supplies. So if you're going to offer an inclusive access program, students have to be able to opt out of it. And there was actually a really excellent legal analysis done of the regulatory history of this, done by our colleagues at Student Defense. And my colleague Aisha will put this link in the chat to this report, but it actually looked at sort of the history of how this regulation came about. And I think the takeaway from this is that these programs, like the idea of offering students the ability to opt out of these programs, and the reason that that's in the regulations, is that the whole idea is that students should have choices about where they shop. But since these programs are often implemented in a way where it's actually more difficult for students to be able to get access to the materials if they do opt out, in some ways, it's going against the original intent of the regulation. So a few critical questions to think about in policy review, and I think in the short term, it's not likely that there's anything that's going to change in terms of this federal regulation, just with how slowly things move. But I think we really need to question, like, does a policy really opt-out policy really qualify if there's no way to like actually access the courseware if they do opt out? Is that meaningful? Are these programs compliant? What even is the definition of below competitive market rates? Because what we see a lot is that students are being automatically billed what the publisher says the price is, when the students could actually get access to the material at a lower price as a print rental or a used book through e-commerce or off-campus sites. And there are plenty of cases where that's true, and the used book market has been an essential competitor to the textbook publishers' own pricing practices. And if we're not considering that competition, we're basically eliminating all of the competitive forces that ever kept textbook prices low. And then finally, I have real questions about these new flat fee program implementations with respect to this federal regulation, because is it really offering the materials at below competitive market rates when, by definition, charging students an average price for their materials means that some students are paying significantly more than what their materials actually cost, while other students are paying significantly less? So these are questions we need to ask, and I think we need to have more conversations within our institutions about this particular piece of fine print. And I see the chat going very quickly, and I'm not able to keep up with it, but just acknowledge that I see you all. All right, so the second type of fine print I want to talk about is textbook contracts. And by the way, I held way back on policy wonkery on that last section. So if you have questions, happy to answer them. All right, second type of fine print, textbook contracts. So I want to acknowledge the amazing work of our colleagues at USPIRG, the student PIRGs, on the report that they did a couple of years ago on automatic textbook billing. Aisha, if you don't mind putting that link in the chat, check out this report. It's great work. And what this report looked at was sort of inside of the textbook contracts, particularly with publishers, and the different types of provisions that can be bad for students. And I think going back to that question of like, what are institutions actually doing to ensure that materials are being offered at below competitive market rate? Well, looking inside of these contracts can actually give you a pretty good sense of what they're considering that. So this is an example of a pretty typical Pearson contract. And this type of pricing structure is typical across all of the major publishing vendors, where pricing is structured as this sort of discount off of the then current online purchase price, or the quote, already discounted inclusive access catalog. And what's concerning about this is that 20% off is relative, right? And what really matters is like, what is that online purchase price? And where do we find it? How do we hold it accountable? How do we ensure that price doesn't rise? And what we're seeing is that these institutions are signing on to these contracts on the premise that the materials are more affordable for students and these programs are going to reduce costs for students. But when you think about it, 20% discount is going to disappear real quick if textbook publishers resume their historical rate of price increases once this model is fully locked in and baked in. And yes, there are contracts like this example where there is written in a cap on how much publishers can increase prices per year, 4% annually. That's still a lot. In 5 years, this discount has disappeared. Or that is not how math works, but you get the point. So here's another example. Again, we're referring to this like mysterious then current McGraw-Hill list price, and the list price of Connect, which is a courseware platform, of ebooks, and tying it to that. And this is a sweet deal. Like, the publishing industry is setting themselves up to be able to just like keep collecting from every student who enrolls in every one of these courses. And if every institution is getting 20% off, it's basically just the price. And then finally, on the publisher front, I do want to point out one other key finding that was in the PERG report, which was these minimum usage rates and quotas that can be built into these contracts. The prevalence of this is actually, I think, waned over time. We've seen this less in contracts. But what this is basically those that, 20% discount, for example, is conditioned on achieving a minimum usage rate for materials. So you have to get, in this contract, it's 90% of the students in the courses remaining opted in, or else you lose your discount. And that's problematic on a couple of levels. So first, it creates sort of a perverse incentive because the institution is incentivized to actually make it harder for students to opt out of these programs because they could lose the discount if too many students opt out. And I think it also is in some ways a tactic that's used by the publisher negotiators of this contract to sort of like create a false sense of urgency about needing to meet that minimum usage rate, or else you lose your discount, to try to like motivate institutions to push more students to stay opted in. So I guess my point here is, if you see this in a contract, first of all, don't push back against this, but if you see it in there, like, see it for what it is, which is an attempt to like force more students to stay opted in. All right. And then the last thing that I'm going to say on publisher contracts is about privacy. And if the Aisha, if you can put the link to this in the chat. The Chronicle did a great series, this summer, a deep dive looking at digital courseware and the privacy policies and issues around that provide some like really sort of chilling insights into what textbook publishers are sort of doing with data. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute when I talk about what vendors are saying to their investors. But check this out. And from our preliminary analysis of publisher privacy policies, you can sort of drive a truck through a lot of what's in there. Okay, so I've talked about publishers a little bit. In terms of the fine print to look for in vendor contracts, we're actually a lot more interested in what's happening in the bookstore outsourcing contracts. Like, I think the sort of what's driving inclusive access, and I think what is going to be the focus of these programs in the near future, are these major corporations, Barnes and Noble and Follett, to whom many institutions are outsourcing their bookstore operations. Their contracts have some provisions in them specifically for this equitable access flat fee model that we need to be paying attention to. And some of what I'm going to say also applies to these platform providers, VitalSource and RedShelf, but I'm not going to get into those specifically here. But if you're interested, Spark has produced a contract library that includes over 200 contracts from over, I think, 100 institutions across the country, where you can download and actually take a look at what's inside of these. And my colleague will put that link in the chat as well. All right. So I'm going to talk about Barnes and Noble contracts here, but there are provisions similar to this in Follett contracts. So the first thing I've been noticing in these contracts is that there's a requirement to use a specific adoption platform for the submission of adoption. And there's like certain outs in the contract for Barnes and Noble if faculty aren't sort of using that platform. And then we're also seeing provisions like this where Barnes and Noble gets to decide the format of the materials. And I think these are places where we could start to see some friction in terms of academic freedom. Not necessarily in the sense that this is overtly stopping a faculty member from choosing any one thing or another, But when you're requiring people to use a specific system for something, we have to ask the question, what materials does that system advantage, and what barriers does it introduce to be able to, for example, adopt OER? And where is it introducing friction for faculty being able to use, alternative materials that aren't set up to just be easily dragged and dropped from a publisher's catalog into Barnes and Noble's, checkbook. And then I think also thinking about this format aspect is really important too. There's some faculty and some students who still believe that print is really important. And if we're essentially granting a corporation the ability to decide what format to deliver to students on the basis of maintaining the value of the program, I think we need to have conversations about these things. And this is hidden in the fine print and may not necessarily come up now, but it could come up in the future. Okay, and I want to take you through just quickly an example of one of these flat fee contracts and like what it actually says. So one of the things we've been seeing in a lot of these is that it is only required materials that are included in the flat fee contracts. And I think that's important because when the example I showed you before of the $25 per credit hour flat fee program, if you extrapolate that out to a 30 credit per year course load, which is sort of maxing it out, that's $750 per year, that every student paying $750 per year. And according to the National Association of College Stores, in the last academic year, students spent an average of $339 on course materials. So that, both numbers, there's nuance to both, but like that math isn't mathing. And if we're only talking about required material, how much more are students having to spend on other materials? And is this like really saving money? Are we grounding these in actual student spending? And I also think we need to think super deeply about it, specifically in the context of these flat fee equitable access programs, and specifically when they are outsourced to Barnes and Noble or Follett or an external vendor, that the price per credit hour model is running that as a for-profit model. We really need to think deeply about this. And essentially how this works, and this is what this contract shows, is that the institution is collecting the $25 and paying that to the bookstore. And then on the other end, what's happening is that, at least in this example, the bookstore is paying back a 10% commission on all of those fees. And this is an example. So like there's a whole history of bookstores paying a commission to the institution, in lieu of rent. And obviously bookstore operations need to pay for themselves. But I think we need to think really deeply about the ethics of having that financial arrangement and sort of having a quote equitable access program where students really don't have choices about where they shop, generate revenue for the institution, and that's specific to an arrangement where you've outsourced it to a third party. And there are contracts that are set up where there's, not a commission, it's a fee for service, or it doesn't have to be set up this way. But when it is set up this way, I think we need to think really deeply about that. Or like, can we take that money and can we put that toward OER? All right, the last set of fine print I want to quickly cover is what vendors are saying to their investors. And I think this is really important because we live in America. It's a capitalist society. These companies, their job is to make money for their shareholders. And that's why they have marketing departments, is to make higher ed forget that. And I'm not, saying anything controversial. This is just a fact. And higher ed often forgets this. And if you listen not to what they're telling you, your administrators, but listen to what they're telling the investors, they often say the quiet part out loud. So Barnes and Noble, this is an excerpt from one of their annual reports and how they talk about their business strategy behind this first day complete or quote equitable access model. That the whole point is that it's a heck of a lot more profitable than historical sales models that rely on individual student marketing and sales. In other words, it's so much better if we don't have to compete for student business. We can just automatically bill them and get, basically 100% sell-through rate. Much easier for us. This is the strategy. And Barnes & Noble in particular this summer issued warning to investors about liquidity. Some of this has been resolved, but this company is pursuing this strategy aggressively, and included statements like this in some of their investor-facing press releases about, First Day Complete is going to be the only model that we offer to many institutional partners going forward. And I've heard anecdotally from campuses of Barnes & Noble essentially saying, if you want us to stay, you have to move to this model. So keep in mind the business strategy is driving what these vendors are telling your institutions, not what's best for your students. And then I would be remiss if I did not circle back to the student data privacy aspect of this all. And I'm going to pick on Pearson here, but this applies to, I think, all of the major publishers. That, again, if you listen to what they're telling their investors, they're telling their investors that the future of their business is to basically monetize the data of their users to sell more and more stuff and enhance the value of the products that they offer. And this is a screenshot from a section of an investor slide deck where you can see this higher ed dot here feeding data into this Pearson user profile. And yes, there's FERPA, yes, there's some limits, but you can do a lot if you get student consent with FERPA, and there's a lot they can do if they get the data outside of FERPA. And what this future looks like is one where the publishing industry is essentially building Netflix. If you look at Pearson's website, this literally looks like Netflix. They're envisioning course materials as something you subscribe to, and that will just sort of feed students content and then suck their data out of it. And is that what we really want for higher ed? And if you look at the pattern of acquisitions, specifically from Pearson, they acquired AI analytics company, they acquired Credly, which is an alternative credentialing platform, PDRI, a workforce assessment provider. All of these acquisitions are all things that could be built and benefit from the student data that can be gleaned through higher education and could impact what students do in higher ed, could impact their future, and if any of these services touch their lives. So it's about time for me to stop talking. And if I can leave you with some recommendations, I would like to leave you with these. And specifically with these flat fee equitable access programs. The first is exempt courses using 100% OER or zero cost materials from the average cost fee. Don't undo the progress you've made. If you can change one thing in a contract, change that. If you have ZTC course marking, that pushing for that is going to be even easier. I think we need to question the for-profit textbook services and think about better ways to get students access to their materials in a way that is revenue neutral for the institution. And then finally, making sure that we're grounding these decisions in actual student spending data and not just going with what the industry is telling us is more affordable for our students. All right, I am going to stop there and stop sharing my screen and then look at everything that is in the chat. Let's see. All right. All right, I see Stephen's question. The bookstore is just selling individual titles. Does the requirement to discount or lower the price still apply if the students are being... Okay, I don't know the answer to that question. Or Stephen, do you want to ask that verbally?
Sure. So if you were saying, Nicole, and you were showing examples of the contracts, but I know my institution does not have a contract with Barnes & Noble that we have a campus-wide inclusive access program, but individual faculty members can go into that relationship for their own individual course. But if you look at the comment that Rich made, it still is pretty hard to tell if, even with the inclusive access, if it was discounted 20%. And some people made comments about that. So I guess my question was, it's like, okay, so how do you know? So, but if my question is confusing, please just go on to the next person.
Yeah, I'm not, I think that seems like a specific circumstance that maybe depends on a lot of factors.
Yeah, and others might be experiencing that too. I think it's just getting back to asking tough questions.
Exactly.
When you're in the situation where you have the opportunity to do so. But thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and a lot of this stuff, like the way that fine print is implemented is often very different than what it says. But what it does do is it creates opportunities for things to develop in the future. It creates a framework, it creates structure for things to develop in the future, and identifying those points at which friction can exist and how it could end up leading things in the future to be, more difficult or prices to rise, for example. Identifying that now and negotiating around it is the best approach. Okay, so I see Rich's question is not a question. Kathy, do you know how we can get actual spending data? That is a great question. And I think, like, ask your students. Bursar charge amounts, like, this is the problem, right? It's so hard to get data. It's all disaggregated in different parts of the institution. I hear, all the time from libraries that they don't have access to some data. And I actually see that as an opportunity potentially for state level policy to encourage more availability of data on these kinds of things. All right, anonymous participant. Campus administrators believe the vendor marketing language and accompanying reference what I characterize as bias research from Michael Moore. That guy. How do we negate this? Yeah, so vendors can trot out a case study that supports just about any conclusion you want to support. And I believe the researcher you mentioned has produced quite a number of those case studies. And not that this necessarily is going to change anything, but this is the academy. We should be demanding rigorous research. Ask for citations, ask for sample sizes, ask for methodology. The only comprehensive statewide study that I am aware of that has been peer reviewed on inclusive access by Elizabeth Spica found that there was zero impact on student outcomes from the inclusive access pilot that they did. So I guess having those like alternative, more rigorous studies to be able to share can be helpful in addressing that. All right, I am getting the signal that this session needs to wrap up. So I thank you for your time, and I'll post the slides in Oxford Abstracts and put my email address in the chat. The recording may end. All right, I'll end the recording.